Coming up, Eddie Howe's big defence of Dan Burn ahead of Nottingham Forest and the injury list that appears to be clearing up for Newcastle United. So we're undercover today just inside the Newcastle United training barn because the weather's absolutely atrocious outside. We've just been in Eddie Howe's press conference and yeah, it was a 40-minute affair. Eddie Howe basically getting asked a lot of questions about Dan Burn, getting a lot of questions about selection policies, and yeah, I thought, to be fair, I thought it was a good assured display from Eddie Howe in the press conference. I thought, as expected, he was always going to back his man in Dan Burn, and he said that basically, for all, there's been a lot made about him having favourites in his squad and selection favourites. He basically said that no player walks in the team and no player stays in the team based on past achievements. I put it to Eddie about last season, that back four that was used to just roll off the tongue, didn't it? Basically Kieran Trippier, Botman, Shaw and Burn. There was even a banner made of it, if you remember. It was celebrated that much, but he said that there's no set favourite in his head, no set favourite formation. He said players will be picked on merit, and basically from his point of view, he says going into this game against Nottingham Forest, everything will be carefully assessed. So there was a lot of questions about Dan Burn. He also said in there that what Dan Burn's achieved here should be celebrated, and he's one of his best signings. He came in when Newcastle were struggling to attract players. They were bottom of the table, and Dan Burn, because he's a Newcastle United supporter and a North East lad, was more than willing to come and take the challenge on, and that's exactly what he's done. But he's been more than just a signing in that time. Some players have left the club since then, and he's been very much part of Newcastle getting in the Champions League. He's been part of that Champions League adventure as well. So there was lots of questions on Dan Burn. On injuries, sadly, Alexander Isak, as we expected, is not going to be back for this game. Anthony Gordon hasn't trained with that twisted ankle, so that's a disappointment for Eddie Howe, really, going into the crunch part of the season. But he says, he hopes he's back sooner rather than later, and it's probably a similar story for people like Joe Willock and people like Elliot Anderson, who've had long-term injuries. They're getting there, but they're not quite ready at this moment in time. So Eddie Howe, very positive, as I say. He fielded questions for 40 minutes. He said that he hopes the second part of the season is going to be much better. But after the Luton game, I think the positives were Newcastle fought back from 4-2 down. They got a point, and if they can take that battling spirit down the City ground, where you're going to be facing a very weary Nottingham Forest team who required extra time and penalties to get through in the FA Cup. They picked up a few injuries. It's going to be a good chance for Newcastle to make progress in the Premier League. So hopefully 3 big points down at the City ground to come on Saturday night.